My name is Caroline Mercer, and the day I returned home from working at the NASA Space Center in Houston, I found out my father had sold my house right out from under me, and he did it with a smile. That's the moment that lives at the front of my memory like a scar you can't help running your thumb over every now and then. I remember standing on the walkway leading up to what used to be my front door, seeing people I had never met carrying boxes inside. A little boy ran around the living room where my grandfather's old clock once stood. There were curtains I had never chosen, a rug I would never have allowed, and a woman's voice from inside calling "Honey, grab the silverware box." The moment was surreal, like stepping into a parallel universe. But to tell this right, I need to start back a bit far enough to show why it all mattered so deeply. I worked at NASA for 9 years, mostly in mission strategy and logistics. People often imagine space workers as astronauts floating in zero-G, but the real magic is in the long shifts on the ground, planning, calculating, troubleshooting. Some weeks I didn't see my own bed more than 2 nights. Some days I didn't see the sun at all. And in between all of that, I supported my family, though I never asked them for anything in return. I bought my house at age 36. Not a luxury mansion, not a sprawling property, just a modest 3-bedroom place outside Sugar Land, Texas. It had pecan trees in back and a creaky porch swing that I liked to sit on after long shifts. I paid for it entirely by myself, every down payment, every tax, every repair. But my family, well, they had their own habits. My dad, Harold, was a man who prided himself on taking care of his own, though in reality that meant bailing out my older brother Nate again and again. Nate wasn't a bad person, not really. He just never grew up. He drifted from job to job, from girlfriend to girlfriend, from half-baked business idea to half-baked disaster. And Dad always swooped in. Car repossession. Dad paid it off. Gambling debt. Dad covered it. Rent past due. Dad sent a check. And each time he'd tell me, "Family comes first, honey." I thought that applied to me too until the day I learned otherwise. About 2 months before the incident, Dad had called me while I was on a late shift. I remember glancing at the caller ID and sighing because I knew Nate must have gotten himself into another mess. Dad said, "Sweetheart, I need you to sign a paper I'm stopping by with tomorrow, just for administrative stuff, in case there's an emergency while you're away so I can take care of the house." I remember pausing. Something in me felt uneasy, but I was working exhausted and I didn't have the energy for suspicion. So I said, "If it's just emergency authorization, fine." He came the next afternoon with the document. He had already highlighted the signature line. He made some joke about how he and Mom were getting older, and who knows, tornado might rip the roof off. He never said a word about selling, transferring title, or surrendering ownership, and I believed him. Looking back, that was the moment the betrayal really happened. The rest was just the fallout. Fast forward to my return home. It was spring, warm Texas air carp swimming in roadside ditches after a week of rain. I turned onto my street, and there it was. Cars in my driveway, lawn chairs on the porch, a red tricycle leaning against my rose bushes, and my father and Nate standing there, arms crossed, waiting. Dad smiled like someone greeting a guest at a barbecue. "Caroline." He said things have changed. Nate added, "You're homeless now. Guess you'll be bunking at the space station." They both laughed, really laughed. Nate, especially. He looked so triumphant, like he had finally won some imaginary competition. I stared at them. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just breathed. I remember thinking, this moment will define everything that comes after. Dad said, "Well, say something." I looked at him. My father, and the strangest thing happened. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel panic. I felt calm. Too calm. Because they thought they had ruined me. And they were so wrong. I smiled. Just a slight curve of the lips. And Nate scowled. "What the hell is so funny?" he snapped. I looked up at the house, my former house, then back at them. "Dad." I said, "You really should have read the fine print." Dad frowned, confused. Nate scoffed, already impatient. But I didn't elaborate, not yet. Instead, I walked back to my car, put my suitcase in the trunk, and drove away while they shouted after me. "Where are you going to live? What now, genius?" I didn't answer. Because I already had a plan, one that began long before they ever signed a pen to paper. They thought I was the naive daughter who trusted too easily. They thought they pulled off the perfect trick, but they didn't know I had been preparing quietly for years. And this was only the beginning. When I drove away from that house, I didn't head to a hotel or coworker's place. I drove to a tiny rental cabin about 40 minutes away because I already had the key. The cabin belonged to a woman I'd met at a NASA community event. Her name was Gladys, a warm lady in her 70s who had rented out her second property for extra income. Months earlier, when Dad first hinted that he wanted emergency authorization paperwork, something in me stirred a quiet alarm. So I secured a backup place to live just in case. It was small, a little crooked in the foundation, smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, but it was mine at least for the moment. I made a pot of tea, sat at the tiny kitchen table, and let myself finally feel the betrayal. The hurt didn't come all at once. It came in waves. Memories of painting that house with my own hands, the nights I spent patching drywall, the time I saved for 6 years to afford the down payment, the birthday dinners in the living room, the Christmas tree near the window. I had built a life there, and they had sold it like a used lawnmower. But when the hurt faded, something else replaced it: clarity. I opened my laptop and pulled up digital records, property filings, bank transfers, legal documents. Because I knew something Dad didn't know, I had already purchased a second property quietly almost 2 years earlier. Smaller, less impressive, but fully paid off and protected in a way the house wasn't. Still, clarity wasn't enough. I needed to understand the full extent of what they had done. How had Dad gotten my signature? What exact paperwork had I signed, and what legal recourse did I have? The next morning, I met with a real estate attorney named Mark Davidson, a slow-speaking, methodical man with glasses and a calming voice. He had helped me with the second property's transfer, and I trusted him. He listened quietly as I explained everything. When I finished, he lifted a thick folder and said, "Well, first off, you're not homeless." I let out a small laugh. "I know." He leaned back. "Secondly, what your father did could qualify as fraudulent use of power of attorney. Depending on how the documents were worded, it could even be criminal. Criminal, a heavy word, a dangerous one." I shook my head. "I'm not looking to put my father in jail." Mark studied me. "What are you looking for?" That was the question, wasn't it? Justice, revenge, closure. "I want them to understand what they did," I said slowly. "And I want Nate held accountable, not protected." Mark nodded. "Then we start by gathering records, and you don't contact them. Not yet." So I didn't. Meanwhile, Dad and Nate did start contacting me. Dad left voicemails. "Sweetheart, look, you'll understand eventually. We did what was best for the family." Nate's messages were less gentle. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. You've never struggled a day in your life. Don't be dramatic. Funny how people who steal from you suddenly think you're overreacting." I didn't reply. 2 weeks later, I requested a full copy of the document I had signed. When Mark slid it across the desk to me, I felt a coldness in my gut, because there in black ink was my signature under a clause Dad had slipped in between 2 paragraphs. It granted him full discretionary authority over property disposition in cases of emergency financial distress or other family necessity. I hadn't noticed it. I hadn't read closely enough. I had trusted. Trust is a powerful thing. It can make you feel safe or make you blind. Mark tapped the paper with his pen. This is where the deceit occurred. He misrepresented the nature of the authorization. I stared at my own handwriting, thinking how Dad had looked me in the eye when I signed it, how he'd joked about storms and tornadoes, but that wasn't the worst part. Mark continued. "Also, your brother benefited financially from this sale. That establishes motive and collusion. Another heavy word, collusion. Dad had always said, Nate just needed a little help. But this wasn't help. This was sabotage dressed up as fatherly compassion. We drafted a plan, a very careful one. We would not confront them with anger or slamming doors or lawsuits. No, we would confront them with truth. Cold, unemotional truth. Before that confrontation, I needed closure. Not the emotional kind, the factual kind. I went back to the house one afternoon. The new owners weren't home, so I just stood outside. The pecan trees swayed gently in the wind. The porch swing still creaked. The walkway had been pressure washed by the new residents. It looked cleaner than ever. I whispered goodbye. It was just wood and paint and concrete, but it had been home. And then I turned and walked away for the last time. After that, I called my father and told him I wanted to meet at his house, just us, no Nate. He sounded relieved. He thought I was ready to forgive and forget. I arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Dad greeted me at the door, arms wide open, expecting a hug. But I stepped back, not out of cruelty, out of boundaries. We sat in the living room. He awkwardly cleared his throat. "You're probably upset," but I interrupted. Calmly, quietly. "Dad, I don't want explanations. I want answers." He blinked. "That's the same thing." "No," I said. "An explanation is justification. An answer is truth." He frowned. Silence stretched between us. I asked, "How long were you planning this?" He shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't planned. Nate needed help. It was an emergency you created with your signature." He stiffened. "I didn't create anything." I handed him a printed copy of the original document, the one I signed. "Did you tell me the truth about what I was signing?" Dad read silently. His face paled. Then he said the classic line of those who betray trust, "I thought you'd understand eventually." I looked him in the eye. "No, Dad. You thought I wouldn't find out." That moment, that facial expression, that was when the first crack of guilt hit him. He couldn't hide it. But this wasn't the time for confrontation to explode. Not yet. This was only the uncovering. And the real consequences, the ones that would change all three of our lives, were still ahead. I didn't speak to my father again for several weeks after that meeting. I needed distance, not just physically, but mentally. Dad had always seen himself as the patriarch, the benevolent decision-maker. But now that image had cracked, and the shards of it cut deep. I wasn't sure how to talk to him, or whether I wanted to, until I had processed what came next. During those weeks, I focused on work. The NASA Center was in a stretch of long operational planning sessions, which meant days that started at 6 a.m. and often ended at 9 or 10 at night. Oddly, the busyness helped. It kept my mind from circling itself into emotional knots. I spent days reviewing mission timelines, technical contingencies, personnel logistics. At night, I would return to the little cedar-scented cabin, microwave frozen dinners, and sit by the window with a journal open, documenting not just what happened, but how I felt about each detail. One evening, as I was writing, I stopped mid-sentence. I stared at the page. I realized I wasn't afraid of losing the house anymore. What I feared losing, and perhaps had already lost, was the belief that I mattered equally in my father's eyes, that I was worth protecting, not sacrificing. When I finally reached out to Mark again, he had already gathered more evidence. We began preparing what would eventually become a formal presentation, not a lawsuit in a courtroom, but a confrontation with undeniable facts. But first, I had to face Nate. Dad had shielded him all his life from consequences, from responsibility, from reality. But I wouldn't. I drove to Nate's apartment. He lived in a cluttered second-floor unit with peeling paint and old beer cans lining the trash bin. When he opened the door and saw me, he smirked. Well, look who crawled back from her space palace. I stepped inside. "We need to talk." He flopped onto his couch, spreading his arms like a self-satisfied king. "Let me guess you're still mad. Boo-hoo." I sat across from him and met his gaze. "Did you know Dad was selling my house?" He chuckled. "Of course." I helped him find the buyers. My heartbeat quickened, but my voice remained even. Did you know the money came from my property value, not his? He shrugged. You weren't using the house. You were gone all the time. Besides, you make more money than we ever will. That stung. Not because it was true, but because he believed that meant I shouldn't care about ownership or fairness or dignity. I leaned forward. You took money that wasn't yours. It was a family asset, he shot back. No, I said. It was mine. I bought it. I maintained it. I paid every bill. Nate rolled his eyes. You always were dramatic. Then I did something unexpected. I handed him a single sheet of paper. He skimmed it lazily at first, then slowed, brow-tightening. It was the ledger of funds from the house sale showing exactly how much money had gone to pay off his debts. Do you know what this proves? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. It proves you weren't being helped. You were being enabled. His jaw tightened. Look, I didn't ask Dad to steal it. I just didn't stop him. That's the problem, I whispered. For a moment, Nate's bravado slipped. I saw something in his eyes, something rare and fleeting shame. But instead of sitting with it, he snapped, You think you're better than us. I rose from the chair. No, I think I want better for us. He didn't speak again. I left the apartment and sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, throat tight. It was the first time I had spoken to Nate as an adult, addressing another adult, not the dutiful sister tolerating the family screw-up. In the following days, Mark and I finalized every piece of documentation, the signed clause, the transfer records, the fraud analysis, and most importantly, the legal consequences if I decided to take action. It was time to bring everything to light. I called Dad and Nate and asked them to meet me at Dad's house, the family home where I grew up, with the faded shutters and the old oak tree shading the front lawn. When I arrived, they were already in the living room. Dad pacing anxiously. Nate slouched in a chair with tight shoulders. I placed a thick folder on the coffee table. Before I say anything, I began. I want you both to listen without interrupting. Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. I proceeded. You sold my house using a power of attorney that was obtained under false pretenses. This is fraud. In Texas, that carries serious legal consequences. Dad looked shocked. Nate looked nervous. I continued. You signed over property you did not own. You used my trust as leverage. I slid the first document toward Dad, the authorization he had manipulated. Did you tell me the full truth about this clause? Dad's eyes dropped. No. I slid the ledger toward Nate. You didn't just passively benefit. You knowingly received stolen funds. He swallowed hard. I didn't. I held up a hand. Don't justify. Just acknowledge. Silence. Then I took a deep breath. I am not filing charges. Not against either of you. I'm not destroying this family. Dad looked up, eyes glistening with relief. But I continued. There will be consequences. They tensed again. I turned to Nate. You will repay what was taken, every cent, not in a lump sum, but through honest work. He opened his mouth to protest, to argue, but the words didn't come. Then I turned to Dad. And you will never again use my trust as a tool. You will never again assume that my effort and property belong to the family as a communal resource. Dad nodded slowly. You're right. I was wrong. I thought I was fixing things. I only made them worse. Nate looked defeated. But there was something else there, too, a flicker of accountability. The confrontation didn't explode. It didn't end in shouting. It ended in something quieter, a reckoning. When I left the house that evening, the air outside was cool. Cicadas hummed. A porch light glowed softly. I felt lighter not because justice had been served, but because truth had. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready for what came next. I didn't sleep much the night after that confrontation, not because I was angry, but because something inside me had shifted. For years, I'd operated with a quiet, unspoken belief that family comes before boundaries. That being the daughter who succeeded meant I had to be the daughter who absorbed the consequences. But now That chapter was closing, and a new one was beginning, built on intention, not obligation. I spent the following week reviewing my personal assets and protections. The second property, the one Dad didn't know about, was nestled on the edge of an older rural neighborhood, quiet and simple. I had purchased it as a backup, but when I stood inside it, again running my fingers over the bare walls, I realized it was more than a contingency plan. It was a future I had quietly created, separate from the family that had taken advantage of me. Still, I wanted more than personal closure. I wanted understanding. So I asked my father to come see me at the rural house alone. When he arrived, he looked smaller somehow, not physically but in presence, like the commanding father figure had softened into a plain man carrying regrets. He stood inside the living room, turning slowly in place. "You bought this?" "Before the sale?" he asked. "Yes," I said. His eyebrows knit. Why I hesitated, then decided to tell him the truth. "Because I didn't trust you," I said quietly. "Not completely. Not after years of watching you enable Nate and then tell me it was my responsibility to understand." Dad took that in, and for once he didn't argue. I continued. "When you showed up with that paper, smiling and casual, I knew there was more you weren't saying. I hoped I was wrong. I signed it anyway because I wanted to believe you were still the man who put my first science medal in a frame and hung it in the hallway." Dad sighed deeply, a long, tired breath. "I'm ashamed," he said. "I thought I was helping your brother survive, and you thought I would survive anything," I replied, "because you never worried about me." He looked at me, really looked at me. "You're right," he said slowly. "You were always the strong one. So I stopped thinking you needed protecting." I crossed my arms gently. Being strong doesn't mean being invulnerable. We sat at the bare kitchen counter, no table yet, and I brewed coffee. The smell filled the small house like a familiar memory. Dad sipped his mug, gaze lowered. "I didn't read that paper carefully," I said. "But you did. You knew what that clause meant." He nodded. "I did. I convinced myself it wasn't really stealing, that it was all family property." I pointed to the floor beneath us. "This is my property, purchased quietly, legally, responsibly, because I learned something a long time ago. Protecting myself doesn't mean excluding family, but it does mean not surrendering myself to them." Dad wiped a hand across his face. "I wish you'd told me," he muttered. I smiled sadly. "You had enough trouble respecting what I did tell you. Why would you have respected something I didn't?" He didn't argue. Then, because life has a sense of timing, Nate called. Dad answered on speaker. "Hey, Dad, the guys at work are talking about a roofing job. They need someone starting Monday. They're paying hourly. I'm thinking I'll take it." Dad looked stunned. Nate had never voluntarily taken hard labor. Dad spoke carefully. "Son, that's good." Nate groaned. "Don't get sentimental about it. I owe money. The only way to pay it back is to earn it. I finally get that." I met Dad's eyes. He knew this wasn't punishment. It was progress. He ended the call, then turned to me. "Your brother's changing," he said. "Maybe," I replied. "But the change has to come from him, not from you building cushions under him." Dad rubbed his palm along the counter. "You sound like your mother," he said softly. "She always believed in hard lessons." It surprised me. We rarely spoke about Mom. She had passed almost a decade earlier, but I remembered her firm, gentle, and unwilling to let any child grow up without learning consequence. Dad stared at the wall. "I miss her," he said quietly. "So do I replied. We sat there for a long moment, not as adversaries and not yet as reconciled family, but as two people who were learning each other again. Later that night, after Dad had gone, I stood outside on the back porch, looking at the small patch of land behind the house. The cicadas hissed in the tall grass. The moonlight brushed the earth in silver. This was where I would rebuild, not out of spite, not out of triumph, but out of gentle, deliberate choice. The next months were slow and steady. I planted flowers out back. I painted rooms. I hung my mother's old wind chimes by the front door. Bit by bit, it became home. Dad and I spoke regularly in cautious conversations, at first, then warmer ones. Nate kept working surprisingly steadily. The roofing crew liked him. He came home sore and sunburned and tired and proud. That part mattered. He sent me his first repayment, a check, small in dollars, but large in meaning. With it came a note. Thanks for not giving up on me. I didn't deserve grace, but I needed direction. Nate, I cried when I read it. A year after the sale, Dad invited me over for a family dinner. This time, I went willingly. When I walked into his house, the house I grew up in, Dad hugged me not to claim ownership or authority, but simply because he loved me. At dinner, Nate served the roast and joked about how climbing roofs had gotten him into the best shape of his life. There was laughter, real laughter, not at someone's expense. At one point, Dad raised his glass. To family, he said, and to learning. We all clinked glasses, and for once the moment felt true. Looking back now, I don't see the story as one about a stolen house or even about betrayal. I see it as a story about boundaries, growth, and forgiveness, because the house they sold, yes, it mattered, but the relationship we rebuilt that mattered more. And that brings us to the place where consequence becomes wisdom and where bitterness becomes understanding. In the months that followed, life settled into a peaceful rhythm, the kind that only arrives after storms have passed and people have confronted themselves. But peace didn't mean everything was perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, of unspoken memory, of paused sentences that hinted at old wounds. Healing wasn't a flip of a switch. It was a slow rebuilding of trust, brick by brick. I spent more time with Dad than I had in years, not because I needed him, but because I wanted to understand him. The man who raised me was different from the man who betrayed me, and I wanted to know how both could exist in one person. Sometimes we would sit in his backyard, just the two of us, and talk as equals. One evening, he pulled out an old dusty box, the kind that holds the forgotten bits of a family's life. Inside were papers and photos, a century of Mercer history. There were grainy, black and white shots of my grandparents, Polaroids of Dad as a boy grinning while missing front teeth, and then pictures of Mom holding me as a baby, laughter caught in motion. Dad tapped an old photo, him 30 years younger, holding a fish on a pier. I was stubborn even then. He chuckled. Stiller, I teased. He smiled in agreement. Then he turned solemn. I want you to know something, Caroline. When I sold your house, I didn't do it because I loved you less. I did it because, in a twisted way, I assumed you would always land on your feet. I sighed softly. But that doesn't make it right. No, he said. It doesn't. He paused, staring at his hands. When your mother was alive, she balanced me. She kept my impulses in check. Without her, I let myself follow old patterns. I nodded. It's easier to fall into old ruts when no one's there to call you out. Dad swallowed hard. I needed to be held accountable. And you did that. You didn't yell. You didn't strike back. You just showed me who I had become. And that was true. If I had screamed or thrown accusations like daggers, he would have retreated into defensiveness. Instead, I had forced him to stand in the quiet reflection of truth. Meanwhile, Nate's transformation continued in surprising ways. He started taking pride in structure, waking up early, eating healthier. He traded cigarettes for protein shakes, bars for savings accounts, excuses for effort. One weekend, he called and asked if he could help me rebuild the back fence at my rural house. When he arrived, he brought his toolbox gloves, and most remarkable of all, a different attitude. We worked side by side in the Texas sun, digging post holes, measuring planks, hammering nails. At one point he said, "You know what? I realized I kept waiting for life to go easy on me, and when it didn't, I blamed everyone else." I glanced over at him. The honesty was new. He continued, "But working on roofs, nobody cares about excuses. If you don't haul shingles, someone else does. If you don't hold the line, someone else will. Hard work doesn't leave room for self-pity." I smiled. "That's a good lesson." He shrugged. "I just wish I'd learned it sooner. I could have said, 'We tried to tell you,' but that wouldn't have helped. So I just said, 'You're learning it now.' That counts." Later that day, after we finished the fence, he reached into his pocket and handed me another repayment envelope, slightly thicker this time. "I still owe you more," he said quietly. "I know," I said, "but I care more about who you're becoming than what you're paying." Nate's voice softened. "Thanks for not going nuclear on me. You could have ruined my life." I looked him in the eye. I didn't want revenge. I wanted responsibility. He nodded slowly. One Sunday months later, we had a small gathering at Dad's place, just the three of us. Dad grilled steaks out back. Nate brought a homemade potato salad that was actually good. And we ate together like a family rediscovering itself. At one point, Nate reached for the salt and said with a smirk, "Hey, remember when I told you that you were homeless now?" Dad winced. But Nate held up a hand. "No, I need to say this." Then he turned to me. "That was a cruel, stupid thing to say. I was insecure, jealous, and childish. I'm sorry." I nodded. "Thank you," Dad added. "And I'm sorry I encouraged that attitude. I laughed when I should have disciplined. I excused when I should have corrected. I let those apologies sink in, not as instant fixes, but as seeds planted." There was a moment of quiet after that, not awkward, but meaningful. That night after dinner, Dad walked me to my car. The evening air was warm, scented with mesquite smoke and fresh-cut grass. He said softly, "I may be the father, but you've taught me more in the last year than I ever taught you." I squeezed his shoulder. "We're all still learning." He nodded. As I drove home, I thought about how fragile human relationships are, how easily damaged, and how painstakingly mended. The story of the house wasn't really about property anymore. It was about truth confronting denial, about growth replacing dependency, about trust broken then rebuilt. Months later, the repayment was complete. Nate called and asked to meet not at Dad's house, and not at mine, but at Mom's old favorite park. We sat on a bench by the duck pond. He handed me the last check, then held onto it a moment longer, looking at me. "This isn't just money," he said quietly. "This is me proving to myself that I can stand on my own." I nodded. "And I'm proud of you." He smiled a genuine, humble smile. "I'm proud of me, too." As I walked away from that park, the wind rustled the trees overhead, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like my family wasn't something I had to endure, but something I could truly belong to again. Because sometimes consequences don't have to destroy, they can reform. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it transforms it. I settled fully into the quiet rhythms of life at the rural house, the one I had secured for myself long before the storm. It had once been just a practical safeguard like keeping a spare tire in the trunk, but now it was a space infused with meaning. I got used to waking up to the sound of birds, instead of traffic sipping coffee on the porch, while mist still hung low on the ground, and hearing wind chimes. Mom's wind chimes resonating softly in the morning air. I found myself appreciating the simplest rituals. On Saturdays, I'd drive into town to the farmer's market, picking up fresh eggs and local honey. Older vendors remembered Mom, who used to shop there too. Mrs. Henderson, who sold homemade jams, always greeted me warmly. Your mother loved the blackberry jam, took 2 jars every Christmas. Each memory offered a kind of gentle stitching of the past into the present. Over time, I noticed a shift inside myself. I wasn't carrying the old bitterness anymore. For months, the betrayal had sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. But gradually, that weight dissolved. Not because I forgot, but because I understood. My father's choices came from misguided love, not malice. My brother's actions came from immaturity, not evil. And I had been shaped by resilience that neither of them fully recognized until they saw me stand my ground. Work at NASA continued steady, challenging, rewarding. But I made sure not to let it consume me. I now had boundaries, ones I honored in both work and family. I didn't work unpaid overtime out of guilt or obligation. I didn't sacrifice weekends to fix others' mistakes. I didn't carry the emotional armor that I once assumed was necessary. One afternoon, Mark, my attorney and now a good friend, came by for a casual visit. We sat on the porch sipping iced tea. He admired the yard, the new fence, the sense of peace. You know, he said not many people would have handled all this with such restraint. Most would have sued, pressed charges, maybe burned every bridge. I smiled. Some bridges need to stay standing, just guarded. He nodded. You didn't go for revenge. You went for restoration. I like that word, restoration. It suggested repair, renewal, and intention. That same evening, I got a call from Dad. His voice sounded lighter, healthier. He asked if I would mind joining him and Nate for a small volunteer event at the community center serving lunch to seniors. The invitation surprised me, but I said yes. The next weekend, we stood side by side behind folding tables, spooning mashed potatoes and gravy, laughing with folks from every walk of life. Dad wore an apron that said Grill Master Retired Edition, which amused everyone. Nate had a hairnet stuffed awkwardly over his still growing out haircut. And me, I just felt present. Not overseeing them, not watching for signs of relapse, just sharing space with them. At one point, an elderly gentleman joked with Nate, "You're a big fella, don't accidentally give out your portion." Nate grinned. "Trust me, sir, I used to eat twice my share. Now I work twice as hard." Dad looked at him with quiet pride. After the volunteer shift, we sat at a picnic table in the warm Texas shade. Dad rested his arms on the table. "Caroline, thank you for coming," he said. "It means a lot." I smiled. "Thanks for inviting me." Nate chimed in. "I can't believe I actually enjoy doing this stuff. I guess working outside all the time changed me. I feel better when I'm useful instead of just lucky." "Luck runs out," I replied. "Work doesn't." He nodded thoughtfully. Later, as we said our goodbyes, Dad hugged me. This hug felt different, not possessive or apologetic, just honest. Driving home, I passed familiar landmarks, the old barber shop with its faded striped pole, the diner with its neon sign flickering in dusk, the church steeple spearing the orange-streaked sky. America felt grounded and real and home. Back at my house, I stood in the yard as crickets replaced birdsong and twilight settled like a soft blanket. I reflected on the year behind me, a year that began with betrayal and ended with understanding, a year that taught me that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors that open only when trust is earned. One evening later that fall, something remarkable happened. Dad and Nate came by unannounced, not in crisis or confrontation, but just to visit. They brought dinner brisket from Dad, cornbread from Nate. We sat in my kitchen passing dishes around telling stories. At one point, Dad got unexpectedly emotional. He said, "You know, when your mother passed, I thought I had to fill both roles. I tried to be protector and provider, but I overprotected one child and underrespected the other. I'm sorry for the imbalance." I placed my hand over his. "I know, and I forgive you." He exhaled slowly, a breath of relief. Nate spoke too. "Caroline, I know I'll never undo what happened, but I'll keep proving I've changed. Not in words, but in choices." I nodded. That's all I ever wanted. When they left that night, I stood on the porch and watched their taillights fade down the country road. A pickup full of two men who had grown more in 1 year than in the 10 years before it. I went inside, turned off the lights, and let the silence of the house settle around me. Not an empty silence, but a warm one. Because here's the truth I came to understand. Houses can be bought and sold, but respect has to be earned. Trust has to be repaired. And family, real family, isn't defined by entitlement or obligation. It's defined by growth, humility, and forgiveness. And as I settled into bed listening to the distant chorus of nighttime life, I felt something I hadn't felt since before all of this began: peace. I often think back to that day, the day I stood on the walkway to my old house watching strangers move through rooms I had once loved. That moment felt like an ending, but now I see it was a beginning, the first step of a larger transformation that would take more courage than anger, more patience than pride. A year and a half had passed since then. Life had steadied in its rhythm like a song slowing down into a familiar melody. My work at NASA remained meaningful, but I made sure it didn't consume every hour of every day. I cherished quiet dinners on my porch, long walks at dusk, and the gentle presence of the wind chimes. I had built a life on purpose, not reaction. In the fall, Dad invited me to a family gathering, a small one. Just him, Nate, and me. But he had arranged it at a meaningful place, Mom's old church hall, where we used to hold community potlucks. He had reserved a side room set with a long table, covered in a humble gingham cloth and plates of home-cooked food. When I walked in, Dad was arranging flowers, simple daisies and carnations, the kind Mom used to pick. Nate walked up, arms open in genuine welcome. "Hey, sis." "Hey," I replied, smiling. We sat together, and as we ate, the conversation wasn't heavy or cautious anymore. It flowed. Dad told stories about his childhood. Nate laughed about roofing mishaps. I shared anecdotes from work, not the classified stuff, of course, but the human side coworkers' long nights, unexpected camaraderie. At one point, Dad grew quiet and asked if we could talk seriously for a moment. "We've said apologies," he began, and accepted them. "But I want to do something more." He reached into his folder and slid a set of papers toward me. "These are updated estate plans. Your house, the second one you purchased, and all your personal assets remain yours alone. But I've also made sure that when I'm gone, certain assets will be divided fairly. No more imbalances. No more favoritism." I looked up, tears stinging unexpectedly. Dad continued, voice steady. "You're my daughter, not my safety net, not my backup plan, not the responsible one who must fix every mistake. Just my daughter, and I should have treated you as such," Nate added. "And I should have treated you as a sister, not a resource." Something softened inside me. Those words mattered. They didn't erase the past, but they honored it honestly. Later after dinner, Dad brought out something wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to me with a shy smile. "It's something I found while going through old boxes," he said quietly. I unwrapped it, and there it was. My first science medal, the one from 6th grade when I won the regional astronomy project. But now the medal wasn't bare. It had been reframed, refitted, cleaned, polished. A fresh backing, a new glass front, and beneath the medal a small engraved plate. "To Caroline, who always reaches higher." My throat closed up. For a moment I couldn't speak. Dad's eyes glistened too. "I shouldn't have forgotten how proud I've always been of you," he whispered. I hugged him fully for the first time in years. Later that night, as we left the church hall, Nate walked beside me. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "When you came home that day, and we laughed at you, why didn't you explode? Why didn't you just tear us apart?" I thought for a moment. "Because I knew if I burned everything down, there'd be nothing left to rebuild," I said. "I didn't want a family made of ashes. I wanted a family made of accountability." Nate processed that slowly. "I'm glad you saw more in us than we deserved." I smiled gently. "Maybe. Or maybe I saw what you could be." We hugged, a sibling embrace that felt earned. In the months that followed, I visited Dad every Sunday. Not out of obligation, but enjoyment. Sometimes we cooked together. Sometimes we tended the garden. Sometimes we simply sat in comfortable silence listening to the world. Nate kept working, kept growing. He eventually became a supervisor on a roofing crew, a leader through effort, not entitlement. And with time, he even began mentoring a younger worker who struggled with discipline, guiding him with patience instead of judgment. As for me, I kept building my own quiet life. I hosted neighbors for potlucks. I started a small stargazing group for local retirees who wanted to learn about constellations. Some evenings I'd sit in my yard with a telescope sharing glimpses of Saturn's rings or the craters of the moon with folks who had never seen them up close. And I realized something important. My strength was never in how much I could endure. It was in how I transformed endurance into wisdom. One late evening, sitting alone beneath a clear Texas sky, I reflected on the entire journey. The betrayal, the confrontation, the repair. I understood now that life gives us many chances to become bitter or better, and we choose. When people ask me why I forgave my father and brother, I don't give them a simple answer. I tell them because if we demand perfection from those we love, we end up alone. But if we require growth, we end up together. And now I'd like to speak directly to you, the listener. Maybe you've gone through something similar. Maybe someone took advantage of your trust. Maybe family wounded you in ways strangers never could. If so, I hope this story reminds you that setting boundaries doesn't mean shutting people out, and choosing forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the harm. It means guiding healing with wisdom. If this story touched you, I invite you to reflect on your own family, your own relationships, your own history of hurt and growth. Feel free to share this story with someone who needs it, or subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories of real people, real lives, and real reckonings of the heart. Because in the end, the house they sold was just walls and wood, but the home we rebuilt inside each other was something far stronger.